The insulin pen sitting on my bedside table contained enough concentrated dosage to send a diabetic into fatal hypoglycemic shock within 20 minutes. My nephew Marcus handed it to me with a smile, insisting I take my evening injection early because we had a big family dinner planned. What he didn't know was that I'm not diabetic. I never have been. The medication he'd been carefully administering for the past 3 weeks was nothing more than saline solution. I'd been swapping out each night after he left my room. My name is Robert Sullivan. I'm 68 years old, and for the last 45 years, I've been living a very specific kind of lie. To the world, to my family, to everyone who thinks they know me. I'm a retired postal worker who spent his career delivering mail in the rain and snow across Denver. I drive a 15-year-old Chevy pickup with a cracked windshield. I shop at discount grocery stores and clip coupons from the Sunday paper. I live in the same modest 2-bedroom ranch house in a working-class neighborhood where I raised my late sister's son after she died of cancer 23 years ago. What nobody knows, not even Marcus, is that those decades of steady government paychecks were just my foundation. Every spare dollar went into buying distressed commercial properties during the 2008 crash. I renovated them quietly, rented them out, and reinvested. Today, I own a portfolio of office buildings and medical complexes across Colorado worth close to $70 million. But I kept it invisible. I wanted Marcus to build his own character, to find his own success without the shadow of easy money turning him soft. I thought I was teaching him the value of hard work. Instead, it seems I only taught him to resent the man he thought was barely scraping by. Before I tell you how I dismantled his life piece by piece, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to love you, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. The nightmares started 4 months ago. I'd been feeling off, nothing serious, just some fatigue and dizziness. I mentioned it casually to Marcus during one of his weekly visits. Within 2 days, he'd moved into my house, insisting he needed to take care of me. He brought his wife Nicole, a woman with a master's degree in healthcare administration and a personality like a corporate assassin. She took one look at my symptoms and declared I was showing signs of diabetes. She scheduled doctor appointments, organized my medications, and took complete control of my daily routine. I was touched at first. I thought maybe I'd succeeded in raising a good man after all. Someone who would care for his aging uncle the way I'd cared for him when his mother died. That feeling lasted exactly 3 weeks. It died the moment I walked past Marcus's bedroom door and heard him whispering into his phone. The house was quiet, the old floorboards creaking under my feet as I made my way toward the bathroom. His door was cracked open just enough that his voice carried into the hallway. I stopped, pressing my back against the wall, every instinct from my years of careful property negotiations telling me to listen before acting. "How long does it take?" Marcus was asking someone, his voice tight with stress. The pharmacist I talked to said consistent doses over 3 to 4 weeks should do it. But he needs to actually be diabetic for it to work right. That's why we had to convince him he was sick first. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands went cold. I leaned closer to the door, my heart pounding so loud I was afraid he'd hear it. "No, he doesn't suspect anything," Marcus continued. "He thinks Nicole's a saint for managing all his medications. He takes the insulin shots without question. The best part is when he crashes, it'll look natural. Old man with uncontrolled diabetes goes into a coma. His heart gives out. Nobody's going to question it." There was a pause. He was listening to whoever was on the other end. "The house is worth maybe $400,000, Marcus said. "But that's not the real prize. I found some documents in his file cabinet last month. Property deeds, LLC registrations, bank statements. Uncle Rob isn't some broke retired mailman. He's been hiding assets for decades. If I'm reading these right, he's worth at least 50, maybe 60 million. Another pause. I could hear the greed dripping from his voice. Nicole ran the numbers. "Once he's gone, we file the death certificate. I'm listed as his only living heir. We liquidate everything before anyone can dig too deep into his holdings. We're talking about retirement money, man. Real money. We'll be in the Cayman Islands before the estate even clears probate." I stood there in the hallway, my legs trembling, not from weakness but from pure rage. This boy I'd raised, the child I'd fed and clothed and put through college by working double shifts, was planning to murder me for my money. And his wife, the woman who smiled at me every morning while preparing my injection, was his accomplice. I didn't confront them. I didn't call the police, not yet, because I realized in that moment that if I acted too quickly, they'd claim I was confused, senile, paranoid. I needed proof. I needed them to believe their plan was working while I built a case that would bury them so deep they'd never see daylight again. I backed away from the door silently and returned to my room. I reached under my mattress and pulled out my phone, the smartphone I'd been hiding from them because they thought I only used a flip phone. I opened my encrypted messaging app and sent 2 texts. The first was to Gerald Moss, my attorney, and the only person who knew the full extent of my empire. The message was simple. Code red. Activate Protocol Phoenix. They're trying to kill me. The second text went to my property manager, a former Marine named Rita Chen, who'd helped me navigate some very difficult negotiations with very dangerous people over the years. Needs surveillance. Full audio, video, my house, Marcus and Nicole, tonight. Within 2 hours, Rita had installed micro cameras in every room of my house. They looked like electrical outlets, smoke detectors, even the thermostat. The audio was crystal clear. Everything Marcus and Nicole said or did would be recorded and uploaded to a secure server in real time. That night, when Marcus came to my room with the insulin pen, I smiled at him. I rolled up my sleeve and let him inject whatever poison they'd loaded into that syringe. But the moment he left, I grabbed the syringe I'd prepared earlier, filled with harmless saline, and injected that instead. I flushed their poison down the toilet and went to bed, letting them think their plan was working perfectly. Over the next week, I watched them through the camera feeds on my phone. I watched them celebrate in the kitchen after each injection, counting down the days until my supposed collapse. I watched Nicole research funeral homes, and Marcus practice the eulogy he'd deliver at my service. They were so confident, so certain of their victory, and I let them be, because I was building something they couldn't see. I was constructing a trap so perfect, so complete, that by the time they realized what was happening, escape would be impossible. On day 28, I decided it was time to die. I waited until evening, until after Marcus had given me my injection. I waited until they'd both gone to the living room to watch television. Then I stumbled out of my bedroom, gripping the doorframe, letting out a low groan of pain. Marcus jumped up from the couch, his eyes wide, not with concern, but with anticipation. "Uncle Rob," he called out, "are you okay?" I didn't answer. I let my knees buckle. I collapsed onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, my head lolling to the side, my eyes rolling back. I'd spent 3 days practicing this fall, making sure I could do it without actually hurting myself. The key was to go limp, to let gravity do the work. "Oh my God!" Nicole shrieked, running over. But she didn't check my pulse. She didn't call 911. She looked at Marcus, her eyes calculating. "Is this it?" Marcus knelt beside me, pressing his fingers against my neck. "His pulse is erratic. He's going into shock." "Perfect," Nicole whispered. "Call 911 now. We need to make this look right." I lay there, listening to my nephew call for an ambulance, his voice perfectly calibrated to sound panicked and devastated. He was a good actor. He'd learned from the best. I'd taught him how to negotiate, how to read people, how to control a situation. I just never thought he'd use those skills against me. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes. The paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher, hooking me up to monitors and oxygen. As they wheeled me out, I caught a glimpse of Marcus and Nicole standing in the doorway. They weren't crying. They were smiling. What they didn't know was that the paramedic checking my vitals was David Park, Rita's cousin, and a former Army medic. What they didn't know was that the ambulance was headed to Street, Mary's Medical Center, a private hospital that I owned through a shell corporation. What they didn't know was that the doctor who would be treating me was on my payroll and had already been briefed on the entire situation. I was about to disappear into a medical coma, and while I was dying, I was going to watch Marcus and Nicole destroy themselves on camera, one crime at a time, until there was nothing left but evidence and handcuffs. The hospital room was cold and sterile, exactly what you'd expect from a critical care unit. I lay motionless in the bed, hooked up to machines that beeped rhythmically, IVs running into my arms, an oxygen cannula in my nose. To anyone watching, I was an old man in a diabetic coma, teetering on the edge of death. Dr. Helena Reyes, the physician I'd hired specifically for this operation, had done an excellent job selling the story to Marcus and Nicole. She'd pulled them into a consultation room with grave expressions and clinical language, explaining that my organs were beginning to fail, that the next 72 hours were critical. "We're doing everything we can," Dr. Reyes had told them, her voice appropriately somber. "But at his age, with this level of metabolic crisis, I need you to prepare for the possibility that he may not recover." I watched the whole conversation through the micro camera hidden in the doctor's ID badge. I watched Marcus nod solemnly, his face a mask of concern. I watched Nicole squeeze his hand, playing the supportive wife. But the moment they left the consultation room and walked down the hallway, their masks dropped. They were giddy, almost skipping toward the elevator. 3 days, Marcus whispered, checking to make sure no nurses were nearby. 3 days, and he's gone. Then we start liquidating. "I've already contacted that estate attorney," Nicole said, pulling out her phone. "The one who specializes in rapid probate. He said if we have the right paperwork, we can start transferring assets within a week." "Did you bring the power of attorney documents?" Marcus asked. Nicole patted her oversized purse. "Right here. We just need his fingerprint. The notary I found said a thumbprint is legally binding if the subject is incapacitated." They entered the elevator, and I switched camera views to the one Rita had installed in the elevator ceiling. They rode up to the ICU floor in silence, but their body language spoke volumes. They were hunters closing in on wounded prey. When they entered my room 20 minutes later, I was ready. I'd coached myself to keep my breathing shallow and rhythmic, to keep my face completely slack, to show no response to any stimulus. I was a vegetable, a body waiting for the inevitable end. Marcus approached the bed first, looking down at me with what might have been regret if I didn't know better. "Hey, Uncle Rob," he said softly. "I know you can't hear me, but I just want you to know I'm grateful for everything you did for me." It took every ounce of willpower not to open my eyes and laugh in his face. Instead, I remained still, playing the role perfectly. Nicole pulled out a folder from her purse, along with a small ink pad. "Let's do this quickly," she said, her voice all business now. Before a nurse comes in, she unfolded a document and placed it on the rolling table next to my bed. I couldn't see it directly, but I knew what it was. A power of attorney form that would give them control over every aspect of my life and assets. Marcus reached for my right hand, lifting it gently. "His fingers are stiff," he muttered. "Just press hard," Nicole instructed, opening the ink pad. "We need a clear print." I felt Marcus grab my thumb, forcing it down onto the ink sponge. The sensation was cold and wet. Then he pressed my thumb against the paper, rolling it slightly to get a full print. They repeated the process 3 times, ensuring they had multiple copies. "Got it," Marcus said, releasing my hand. It dropped back onto the bed with a dull thud. Nicole was already folding the documents, tucking them back into her purse. "Perfect. I'll get these notarized tomorrow morning. By tomorrow afternoon, we'll have full legal control." "What about the DNR?" Marcus asked. My blood ran cold. "DNR, do not resuscitate. Already drafted," Nicole said, pulling out another document. "We'll sign this one as his medical proxies. When his vitals start to fail, the hospital won't intervene. Natural death. Clean." They spent the next 10 minutes discussing logistics like I was a business transaction instead of a human being. They talked about which properties to sell first, which accounts to drain, how to move money offshore. They planned my funeral down to the flower arrangements. Not because they cared, but because they needed to look bereaved for the cameras. When they finally left, I remained still for another 30 minutes, making sure they were truly gone. Then I opened my eyes. I looked directly at the camera hidden in the smoke detector above my bed. I held up my ink-stained thumb and smiled. "Did you get all that?" I said softly. My phone, hidden under the blankets, buzzed with a text from Rita. Every word, every frame. They're finished. But I wasn't done yet. Because the power of attorney they'd just forged wasn't the real document. Gerald had prepared a decoy, loaded with clauses that would actually strip them of any claim to my estate, while simultaneously documenting their fraud. Every signature, every thumbprint they'd just obtained, was evidence of conspiracy and elder abuse. I settled back into my coma, waiting for phase 2, because tomorrow morning, Marcus and Nicole were going to wake up to a nightmare they couldn't imagine, and I was going to enjoy every single second of their destruction. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp Colorado sunlight that makes everything look deceptively peaceful. Marcus and Nicole had stayed overnight at my house, comfortable in their assumption that I was slowly dying in a hospital bed across town. What they didn't know was that while they slept, Gerald Moss had been busy. Very busy. At exactly 8:30 a.m., Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from New York. He answered groggily, still in bed. "Mr. Sullivan? This is Diana Hartwell from First Continental Bank's Fraud Investigation Division. We need to speak with you immediately regarding several accounts linked to Robert Sullivan's Social Security number." Marcus sat up straight, suddenly very awake. "What? What accounts?" "Sir, we've flagged approximately 47 different transactions over the past 2 weeks that show patterns consistent with identity theft and financial exploitation. We're seeing attempted wire transfers, property deed modifications, and several applications for lines of credit using Mr. Sullivan's information. We need you to come to our Denver branch immediately to verify your identity and relationship to the account holder." I watched this entire conversation unfold through the camera Rita had hidden in the bedroom's air vent. I watched the color drain from Marcus's face. I watched him look at Nicole, panic rising in his eyes. "I don't know anything about 47 transactions," Marcus stammered. "I'm his nephew. I have power of attorney because he's in the hospital." "Sir, we don't have any record of a valid power of attorney on file, and several of these transactions occurred before Mr. Sullivan's hospitalization. We'll need to see documentation immediately, or we're required to freeze all associated accounts and report this to federal authorities." The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, his hands trembling. "They're freezing the accounts," he whispered. "How is that possible? We were so careful." Nicole grabbed her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Check your email. Check everything. Something's wrong." What they found was a cascade of disasters. Emails from banks, investment firms, property management companies, all with the same message. Suspicious activity detected, accounts frozen, pending investigation, law enforcement notified. Every single financial thread they'd been planning to pull was suddenly locked down tight. "This doesn't make sense," Marcus said, his voice rising. "Uncle Rob's in a coma. He can't have reported anything. How did they know?" "Someone tipped them off," Nicole hissed. "Someone knows what we're doing." They spent the next 3 hours frantically calling lawyers, banks, anyone who might help them understand what was happening. But every conversation ended the same way. Frozen accounts, pending investigations, no access. By noon, they were desperate. "We need to go to the hospital," Nicole finally said. "We need to see if he somehow woke up and reported us." 20 minutes later, they burst into my ICU room, their faces flushed with panic and anger. Dr. Reyes tried to stop them, but Marcus pushed past her, storming up to my bedside. I remained perfectly still, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. "Uncle Rob," Marcus grabbed my shoulder, shaking me. "Can you hear me? Did you report us? Did you call the banks?" I didn't respond. I was a statue, an empty shell. Nicole pulled out her phone, pacing the room. "This is insane. He's unconscious. He couldn't have done this. Someone else knows." What they didn't realize was that the someone else was me, orchestrating their destruction from this very hospital bed. While they'd been planning my funeral, I'd been activating a network of protections I'd built over decades. Every account had fail-safe protocols. Every property had automatic fraud alerts. The moment they'd tried to access anything with that forged power of attorney, the entire system had locked down and started generating evidence. "Maybe we should cut our losses," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe we should just leave. Go somewhere they can't find us. With what money? Nicole snapped. Everything's frozen. We have maybe $5,000 in cash. That won't get us anywhere. They stood there in my hospital room, their plan collapsing around them, and I felt a cold satisfaction settle into my chest. But I wasn't ready to reveal myself yet, because there was still one more twist coming, one more knife I needed to bury in their backs. At exactly 2 p.m., a man in an expensive suit walked into my hospital room. He was tall, with silver hair, and the kind of presence that commands immediate attention. Marcus and Nicole stopped their arguing and turned to face him. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded. "My name is Thomas Brennan," the man said, his voice smooth and professional. "I'm the lead investigator for the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit, and I'm here to inform you that you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, fraud, and attempted theft of assets exceeding $10 million. The room went silent, except for the steady beep of my heart monitor. "What?" Nicole's voice came out as a squeak. "That's ridiculous. We haven't done anything." Thomas pulled out a tablet and turned it toward them. On the screen was a video, crystal clear and damning. It showed Marcus whispering into his phone 4 weeks ago. The pharmacist I talked to said consistent doses over 3 to 4 weeks should do it. Nicole's face went white. "Where did you get that?" "Mr. Sullivan's home security system," Thomas said calmly. "A very sophisticated system, I might add. We have approximately 80 hours of footage documenting your entire conspiracy. Your discussions about killing him with insulin injections. Your forged power of attorney documents. Your plans to liquidate his assets and flee the country. All of it, recorded in high definition, with timestamps and metadata that will hold up in any court." Marcus backed away, shaking his head. No, this isn't possible. Uncle Rob doesn't have security cameras. He doesn't even have a smartphone." Thomas smiled. "You'd be surprised what your uncle has. Or rather, what he doesn't have. For example, he doesn't have diabetes. He never did. Every injection you gave him was saline solution. Every symptom you thought you were causing was theater. He's been awake this entire time, watching you destroy yourselves." That's when I decided it was time. I'd been lying still long enough. I opened my eyes. I looked directly at Marcus, letting him see the awareness, the intelligence, the absolute fury burning in my gaze. "Hello, Marcus," I said, my voice strong and clear. "Did you really think I'd let you kill me without a fight?" The shock on his face was beautiful. Nicole actually stumbled backward, hitting the wall, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I sat up slowly, pulling the IV lines from my arms with practiced ease. The monitors started beeping in alarm, but Dr. Reyes calmly reached over and shut them off. "You've been awake?" Marcus whispered, his voice broken. "The whole time? Every single moment," I said, standing up from the bed. I was wearing hospital scrubs, but I straightened my shoulders and looked down at them with all the authority I'd earned over 7 decades of surviving and succeeding. "I heard you planning my murder. I watched you forge documents. I listened to you count my money like it was already yours. And I documented everything." I walked toward them, and they actually backed away, pressing themselves against the wall like cornered animals. "The insulin you were giving me? Harmless saline. The diabetic symptoms? Acting. The security cameras? Installed the day after I heard you plotting. Everything you did, everything you said, it's all recorded, all time-stamped, all authenticated by forensic experts. You're not just caught, Marcus. You're buried." Nicole tried to speak, but Thomas held up his hand. "Save it for your lawyer. You're going to need a very good one." 2 uniformed officers entered the room, handcuffs ready. They separated Marcus and Nicole, reading them their rights with clinical efficiency. I watched as the steel bracelets clicked shut around their wrists, the sound crisp and final. Marcus looked at me one last time, tears streaming down his face. "Uncle Rob, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. It was Nicole's idea. She manipulated me. But I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt nothing but cold, hard justice. You tried to kill me for money that you never would have gotten anyway," I said quietly. "Did you really think I hadn't planned for this? Did you think I'd leave everything to someone without testing their character first? Marcus, I've spent 45 years building an empire specifically so I could separate people who loved me from people who loved my money. You failed the test. Spectacularly. As they dragged him out of the room, he screamed one last time. You set me up! This whole thing was a trap! I smiled then, cold and sharp. No, Marcus, you set yourself up. I just gave you the rope. You're the one who chose to hang yourself with it. The door closed behind them, and silence filled the room. Thomas turned to me, extending his hand. That was quite a performance, Mr. Sullivan. I've been in law enforcement for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Sometimes the best way to catch a thief, I said, shaking his hand, is to let them think they've already won. 3 months later, I stood in a courtroom in downtown Denver, watching as a judge sentenced Marcus Sullivan and Nicole Chen to 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder, 20 counts of fraud, and elder abuse. The evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the forged documents, the testimony from Dr. Reyes and the investigators. It was an airtight case. Marcus didn't look at me during sentencing. Nicole did, though. She stared at me with pure hatred, as if I were the villain in this story, as if she hadn't tried to murder me for my bank account. When it was over, when they were led away in shackles, Gerald Moss put his hand on my shoulder. You know, he said quietly, most people would have just called the police immediately. What you did, building that case, letting them incriminate themselves, it was brilliant. But it was also dangerous. I know, I said. But I needed the world to see exactly who they were. I needed there to be no doubt, no sympathy, no chance of them manipulating their way out. People need to understand that elder abuse isn't just about stealing money. It's about stealing dignity, stealing trust, stealing the last years of someone's life. Marcus and Nicole needed to face absolute consequences. That evening, I drove back to my modest house in my old Chevy pickup. Everything looked the same from the outside. The neighbors still thought I was just a retired mailman living a simple life. But inside, I'd had Rita remove all the surveillance equipment. The house was clean, empty, quiet. I sat in my living room and looked at the photo on the mantel of my sister, Marcus's mother. Her eyes were kind, full of hope. I wondered what she would think of how her son turned out. I wondered if she'd blame me for raising him wrong, for keeping my wealth secret, for testing him in ways that revealed his true nature. But then I remembered something she told me before she died. Rob, she'd said, gripping my hand in her hospital bed, take care of my boy, but don't let him take advantage of you. Love him, but make sure he earns it. I'd kept that promise. I'd loved Marcus. I'd given him everything he needed, but I'd also made sure he had to prove himself worthy of more. He'd failed that test long before he ever tried to poison me. The insulin was just the final evidence of a rot that had been growing for years. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. $70 million, give or take, spread across properties and investments that would continue growing long after I was gone. But not a single penny would go to Marcus. I'd already rewritten my will. The entire estate would be divided among 3 charities. A cancer research fund in my sister's name, a scholarship program for underprivileged kids, and an organization that protected elderly people from financial abuse. Marcus wanted my money so badly he was willing to kill for it. Now he'd spend the next 15 years in prison, knowing that money would be used to help people instead of feeding his greed. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. I was 68 years old. I was alive, and I'd just taught the world a lesson about loyalty, family, and the consequences of betrayal. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. Family isn't defined by genetics or obligation. Real family is built on respect, trust, and genuine love. And when someone betrays that, when they choose greed over gratitude, you don't owe them forgiveness. You owe them justice. Marcus thought he was stealing from a weak old man. He didn't realize he was going up against someone who'd spent a lifetime outthinking, outworking, and outsmarting people far more dangerous than him. He gambled everything on the assumption that I was too old, too trusting, too blind to see what he was doing. He was wrong, and now he'll have 15 years to think about that mistake. I stood up from my chair and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood I'd called home for decades. Tomorrow, I'd go back to clipping coupons and driving my old truck. I'd go back to being invisible, unremarkable, the retired postal worker nobody paid attention to. But I'd do it with the satisfaction of knowing that I'd protected myself, exposed the truth, and ensured that justice was served. Sometimes the best revenge isn't violence or cruelty. It's simply refusing to be a victim and making sure the world sees your enemies for exactly what they are. Marcus and Nicole wanted to make me disappear. Instead, I made their true faces visible to everyone. And that, I think, is the ultimate form of justice.